Hi, everyone. We are excited to be chatting with you all today about AI governance. Just going to give another minute or two to let some additional folks trickle in before we get started. Great. Well, we can get started now. Again, thank you all for attending Molk's webinar on AI governance. There has really been a significant influx of AI products present in our everyday lives, whether you use that personally or professionally or both. And it's really important to understand the risks and the limitations of AI, as well as how to use and manage AI responsibly. And we aim to tackle those topics today in this webinar. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Goldstein McGowan, and I am a vice president here at Molk, overseeing our growth and venture team. And I've been at Molk for about 5 years now. Molk Partners is an ESG advisory firm supporting private market investors and their portfolio companies on ESG management, including ESG due diligence, post-investment engagement, ESG program development and reporting, as well as bespoke projects for portfolio companies related to carbon accounting, employee engagement, and responsible AI practices, to name a few. Throughout my time at Molk, I have really seen a significant uptick in investments in AI companies, as well as companies incorporating AI into their internal and external processes. And I found that companies aren't always developing sufficient governance in tandem with their AI development and rollout, which is why responsible AI use is really key. And I am joined by Stephen Rockwell, who I will let introduce himself.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Stephen Rockwell. I'm the founder of both humanservices.ai, which provides support to impact organizations and nonprofits and government, and iBlueprint.ai, which is a AI building, collaboration, testing, and deployment platform. And spend a lot of time on these issues in different contexts. And so really happy to be here today to talk with Emily and all of you about governance and responsible AI.
Perfect. So over the next 45 minutes, we're hoping that you all will understand the background on AI, why AI governance is important, and best practices for responsible AI development, management, and usage. And at the end, we will have time for a Q&A, so feel free to start putting your questions in the chat and we can get to those later. And I will pass it off to Stephen to get us started.
Great. We're going to cover just some of the basics here around make sure we're all starting from the same place around what are the common forms of AI and then head into some of the risks and issues that we see. So, artificial intelligence generally is the broad field of computer science that's focused on creating machines that are capable of doing things that we typically associate with human intelligence. Machine learning is a subset of AI. Actually, all of these on the list are a subset of AI involving algorithms and statistical models that enable computers to improve their performance on a task through their experience. This becomes important as we get to generative AI, which is based on deep learning. It's a subset of machine learning based on these artificial neural networks where the algorithms learn from large amounts of data to identify patterns and make decisions. I should say, um, uh, Gregory Hinton's talk with John Stewart, of all people, in a recent podcast on artificial neural networks and how that works, I really commend it to you. It really is the best description, easy to understand description of how these things were built. He's the godfather or considered one of the godfathers of AI. Um, Generative AI is where we're spending a lot of our time right now, right? It's what the buzz has been about since ChatGPT launched in November 2022. Um, and that refers to the kinds of AI technologies that generate new content, ideas, data that are coherent, that they're plausible, um, and they resemble human-generated outputs. Um, and they're based on those neural networks and deep learning, which was a different approach to how to think about um, computer science. Finally, and we're hearing this a lot in the last year, is agentic AI, right? And it really has only been in the last year where some of these technologies have come onto the market in a more aggressive way. And in the context of AI, agents are entities that are capable of sensing the environment, making decisions, and taking actions autonomously, given some predetermined goals. And so in the past, you might have used robotic process automation, which was another form of intelligent automation, where you're giving very explicit instructions and it's delivering on that automation. Agentic agents have a lot more leeway and decision-making capability, um, and so they operate more flexibly and autonomously. Um, so maybe we head to the next slide on this. Having said that, we're seeing lots of gains, obviously, with generative AI, increasingly with agentic AI. Machine learning has been part of our lives, um, for an even longer period of time. But on the generative AI side, even though we have some pretty significant adoption in pretty much everyone at this point, um, very few of those sort of expected productivity gains have been realized. A recent MIT report said that like only 5% of Gen AI pilots and programs have any effect on P&L. A lot of things are having a tough time getting from the pilot phase or the learning phase into the production phase. Um, and very few thus far of the gains have been materialized. That's actually what I'm spending a lot of time on with this iBlueprint is sort of how do we realize those gains? And part of what I think you're going to hear today is that governance and knowledge sharing and working on the AI together to make sure it's responsible is a big part of the productivity conversation, right? And so right now we have folks sort of off in their silos. Maybe you have an AI policy, usage policy in your organization, but you're still off in your silo doing your own thing. And I think what you'll hear today is that this is AI for productivity and for governance and responsible deployment of AI is very much a team activity. And they're real risks, right? For all of us. We've heard some of the meta risks around AGI, but I think for most of us, we have a much narrow set of concerns, but still really, really important, right? And I think they break down really on is this accuracy? Is this an accurate is the AI doing what I intended it to do? Um, a lot of QA, a lot of this is wrapped up in your QA processes around the AI product that you're deploying. We've all heard about hallucinations with generative AI. Those have become less and less common. And I think what we're seeing more with generative AI is not only bias, but the kinds of steering towards certain behavior. Um, and really, like the number one use case for generative AI in 2025 is the AI in relation to a person, relational AI. And so when you start thinking about like how does bias manifest in a relationship, we're really into some pretty interesting territory. And we've identified some things here. You could have discriminatory language, but really um, even things that are more steering away, like let's say you had a I do a lot of work in benefits access, and part of what we want our AI to do is help people sign up for public benefits. If in our and we've actually had to steal against this where we may be, because of the underlying data we're using and the training we're using and the prompting we're using, we may be steering different types of people away from accessing benefits. And so that's a real life example of where some of that bias can play out. Um, Obviously, machine learning has been a big part of our lives, like we said earlier, for a while. And those sort of predictive models, especially in a healthcare context, whether it's on the administrative side or whether it's actually on the sort of care delivery side, diagnoses, etc., we can imagine that those systems that do include bias or are inaccurate, like we're literally and sometimes talking sort of life and death. So putting the governance systems around that you'll hear about in a minute in place become vitally important. Then on agents, if in fact we're giving agents some autonomy to do actions on their own, right? Which is a little different than engaging your LLM to say, hey, I'm telling you right now to write this piece of content for me or to create this movie. You're actually giving them a little bit more leeway. You can imagine then the governance around that, that the QA around that becomes really, really important, right? And so we again on the bias side, if there's coded language or if there's other forms of bias that show up in automated systems using an agent, and there's actually there's a lot of case law around this already, that we're seeing that can really drive some outcomes that we're not looking for and sort of put you on the hook. And that's what the next slide is going to cover here is that like you we have seen cases of um, uh, reputable organizations finding themselves in some hot water due to AI or the misplacement of AI, and really, frankly, just not putting enough governance and time um, into the deployment. Doesn't mean that they'll be perfect, but there's a notion of due diligence here that when that's not happening, you really are opening yourself up into the kinds of headlines that you're seeing here. And so part of the story today is like let's avoid that by putting the right constraints and the right processes in place so that we don't end up like Workday with a lawsuit um, around age discrimination in hiring, or that we are checking the outputs and asking the LLM to cite its sources for really important things that matter. So we don't run into a case where lawyers here in this headline are citing fake cases, right? The LLM wants to be helpful, and sometimes even if it doesn't have the data, it's still trying to give you something to go on. And that's the answer around that is really solid governance, but also, hey, ChatGPT, please cite your sources so I can go back and verify and validate what's happening. So um, there's obviously a lot of opportunity, but there's the potential for downside in this. And part of what we're covering off on today is making sure that you're ready to handle those potential downsides and you don't, avoid those to the degree that you can with this technology.
Perfect. And now in this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about why AI governance is important, kind of adding on to what Stephen has already shared and the ESG implications therein. So outside of this being the right thing to do and to avoid the headline risk, as Stephen had already mentioned, there are many other reasons to maintain proper AI governance controls. AI governance is really a competitive advantage to build customer trust, maintain strong development and deployment, recruit and retain top talent, and to meet regulatory compliance standards. Customers, at the end of the day, really want to use tools that are unbiased, accurate, and transparent with their development. A study by Forbes found that companies are more likely to trust an AI company when AI governance is in place, really stressing the importance for customer acquisition. Companies can also deploy AI faster, given continuous checks throughout the development process can really lead to fewer setbacks and material impacts on actual deployment. And in addition to customers and deployment, studies have also shown that employees really want to know that their employer is using technology in an ethical way. Thus, not maintaining those responsible AI practices could impact recruitment and retention of top talent. And though most companies believe AI can be a competitive advantage, biased AI can have pretty significant business impacts, such as lost revenue, customer distrust, employee turnover, and legal fees. And as such, the benefits of maintaining AI governance is really multifaceted, impacting many different stakeholders. And as I touched on in the previous slide, there are regulatory pressures to maintain these responsible AI practices, which are really playing catch up due to how fast AI development has occurred in the past few years. So, starting out with the EU AI Act, which has come into effect in 2024 and will be enforced starting next August. This regulation deems AI systems as acceptable, high, limited, and low risk, and outlines obligations around transparency, quality and assurance, and lifecycle management. The EUAI Act has also identified uses that are prohibited, such as social scoring systems or exploitative AI harming vulnerable groups. And although most companies are likely not considering that as part of their core focus, really important to consider what are those kind of unacceptable factors when understanding the regulatory obligations here. And to comply with this regulation, companies will need to maintain a risk management system, data governance and quality, traceability and oversight, and proper documentation, among other factors. So it's a pretty robust program that companies will need to maintain in order to adhere to this regulation. And the regulation for the EU AI Act falls under any companies based in the EU and or servicing EU customers. So pretty wide variety of customers. Within Canada, there is a proposed regulation called the Canada AI and Data Act, which applies to high impact AI companies, though the definition for high impact is not yet determined. These requirements are similar to the EU AI Act, though likely fewer companies are in scope given the high bar. It's only relevant for high impact AI companies. And given this is currently being discussed, it's unlikely to go under effect until 2026 or 2027 at the earliest. And in the US, as of now, AI is really being regulated at the state level, with the most advanced regulation coming out of Colorado. The Colorado AI law was approved back last May, and full enforcement will start in June 2026. The law regulates high-risk AI systems, kind of like the Canadian proposal, that are a substantial factor in making consequential decisions, as in significant effects on consumers, such as employment, housing, healthcare systems, benefits, like Stephen had mentioned earlier. And in-scope parties would include companies that are serving consumers or are used by developers or companies in Colorado. So although the law is only kind of their jurisdiction is within Colorado, there are a lot of companies that may fall into scope that are not just based in Colorado. Unlike the EU AI Act, this law would require risk monitoring, transparency, bias prevention, among other factors. But given the higher bar, likely fewer companies would fall into scope than the EU AI Act. And importantly, these regulations only apply to companies that develop and market AI as a product or service, and not for companies that only leverage AI internally. So that's an important consideration when understanding if your company is under jurisdiction here. So what does this mean for you? All companies should look into if they are in scope for any of these regulation and keep up to date on any new regulation that may be passed. There are additional proposals across the United States, and other countries are really focused on kind of managing AI responsibility. So we would expect that additional regulations will be proposed and potentially ratified over the next few years. Now, taking a bit of a step back to talk about what ESG implications are for responsible AI use, which covers ethical AI use, like we've discussed thus far, as well as social and environmental considerations. So across the three types of AI tools that we've discussed earlier in this webinar, there are distinct risks for each of them. So for example, with generative AI models, these can be biased and offer misinformation. With regard to machine learning, these are dependent on their data sets, which could lead to data inequity. And large data sets could also mean a more significant environmental footprint in order to process that information. And then for agentic AI, there may be a lack of human oversight, which could impact user safety based on the kind of decisions that that AI tool is making autonomously. Now, looking specifically across the E, the S, and the G, the biggest environmental impact for AI is the use of large amounts of energy needed for model training and other environmental resources required for maintaining data centers, such as water for cooling. And these companies that are managing their own data centers would have even more of a direct responsibility for managing the efficiency of their kind of environmental impact. And so companies should really be considerate about their resource efficiency, including model efficiency, in order to reduce the environmental impact of their AI usage. With regard to social impacts, the influx of AI can mean more potential bias in development as well as outcomes. So AI can also impact user safety, particularly with agentic AI models making harmful suggestions or comments to users. I know we've seen some of those impacts in the headlines as well over the past few months. And AI is also being used to replace employees, which can impact employee sentiment and lead to more job insecurity and need for reskilling. And as we've discussed today regarding governance, companies really must ensure that their AI program includes policies and trainings, as well as audits to ensure that they can meet these regulatory obligations and confirm that their governance practices are actually working. It's one thing to have a policy, but if employees aren't actually reviewing the policy and internalizing the information and acting upon it, the policy really doesn't hold up in practice. Now, what I'm sure most of you are hoping to get from this is understanding now that we know what AI is, what the risks are, why AI governance is important, what does that actually look like in practice, and how can this be implemented across various use cases and development of a company? So we recognize that not all AI companies are developing their own AI models, but these AI principles should really be considered for both AI development internally as well as third-party model use, and can be adapted based on if those are proprietary models or third-party models. So, starting out with accountability, it's important to define who is managing AI governance at the company. This does not have to be one individual, it could be a group of individuals, but there needs to be someone or someone's responsible for managing AI governance. For data quality, data should be representative of the population that it is serving and free from bias. So if there is a tool serving certain population, the data should be representative of that population versus kind of a broad data set, not relevant to those potential outcomes and outputs. With regard to accuracy, companies should have a minimum threshold of 85% accuracy, which should be assessed through continuous monitoring and pre and post deployment. We recognize that AI is not 100% accurate, and it would be pretty impossible to expect that from AI, at least today. So having a standard accuracy threshold, and really the goal is to continue to improve that accuracy over time. Transparency and accountability. Stakeholders should be aware that they are using AI, and the outputs should be really clear, traceable, and explainable. If an AI tool is being used in a product or service, users or customers should be aware that AI is supporting that product, and it shouldn't be kind of a hidden feature. Oversight, human in the loop reviews of outputs are really critical to ensuring that accuracy, like I mentioned. Companies should be vetting third-party models if they are using third-party models, and also conducting regular risk mapping. So even if a company is using a third-party model, there still should be oversight to ensure that those outputs are accurate when being used. With regard to data privacy, this is really critical to manage personal user data, as well as ensure that data is anonymized in model development. And then lastly, diversity. Diversity within developers also helps to prevent bias and develop better systems. So bias is one of the key risks that we have talked about thus far, and having that diverse component in developers really can help kind of manage that potential bias. And we know that there are varying size of companies and maturity, and thus we recognize not all AI governance practices can or necessarily should be implemented at the onset. So kind of going back to some of the areas that I mentioned on the previous slide, for smaller, earlier stage businesses, it's really common not to have a large compliance team or even a dedicated person to support on AI governance controls. And as such, we typically see companies maintain a cross-functional working group to manage AI governance and recommend that high-risk use cases are monitored for internal knowledge and external regulatory reporting as is necessary. We also would recommend companies aim to develop an acceptable use policy and provide workforce training on that policy to ensure alignment with the words within that policy. For mid-sized businesses, we would expect more robust controls, including a formal owner of AI. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, this could be an AI committee or it could be an individual. And also, we would expect to see a suite of governance policies for both internal and external stakeholders. So if there is an external AI tool, providing guidance to customers on how they should leverage that tool to prevent over-reliance, for example. We would also expect mid-sized businesses to have a risk and impact assessments in place, as well as formal tracking of model performance in order to make those improvements over time. And then lastly, for large enterprise level businesses, we would really expect a robust AI governance program, which includes real-time monitoring tools, external certification and audits, and strong transparency controls overall, in addition to the other expectations outlined for those smaller businesses. And importantly, before I move on from this is really a framework and should not be followed to a T. Some AI tools may be higher risk and the company may be smaller, but having stronger controls given the higher risk use case would be necessary at an earlier stage. On the other hand, if it's a large company, but the AI product is relatively low risk and requires fewer controls, the necessity for a really robust program would kind of diminish. So use this as a framework and a tool and not necessarily an explicit guide on what is kind of explicitly relevant at each size of maturity. Pass it back to Stephen.
Yeah, that's some really solid advice there. Maybe just to imbue that a little bit with some inclusive AI development practices. I sat on the Partnership on AI's Global Task Force on Inclusive AI. So this content's coming from that work. The Partnership on AI brings together industry, academia, activists, people that are concerned about our future and what it means with AI. And so this was the outcomes from a really diverse group of sort of how do you think about doing um, AI work, AI development work in ways that are inclusive and meet some of the governance precepts that Emily referred to. So it's a little bit more how to. So the first thing is in the process, the idea is to be engaging the stakeholders ongoing. And if you in some ways, if you're doing AI product development, hopefully you're likely doing some of this already in terms of listening to users. Um, the suggestion here is maybe to double down on that and to do so early and often. There's all kinds of potential edge cases that by not having a diverse group of stakeholders that you might miss, and some of those unintended impacts, if you can catch them in a QA process or in a design process, I think it saves potential trouble downstream. Um, we sort of referred to this other one, I think, multiple times today around representation and data, and sort of what does it mean to debias a data set, right? And so having representation of folks that might be affected or might be stereotyped in a certain way to look at that data in some detail is part of like the debiasing process to address that. And when it comes to deployment, that we want to make sure that if you are targeting in any way vulnerable communities with an AI deployment, that they're engaged in that deployment. Um, that you can imagine scenarios where we're deploying something at some scale and we're not considering, you know, how does this play out in a different language? For example, when people are going to engage our tool in a different language, and have we looked at that and made sure that it's going to deploy correctly in that language, right? As an example. We've talked about governance a lot today, obviously. Um, and really the one thing maybe that's here is like, what's the process when someone does have an issue? How are how are they able to raise it? How's the user able to raise the issue? And what's our process for dealing with it? That really does speak in some way to an ongoing governance and ongoing QA that we're doing. And where need be, like engaging the public in making sure that those voices are heard. So, um, that much of this advice is largely targeted at the enterprise group that Emily mentioned before, but there are pieces of these things that I think you could um, draw from in and sort of supplement your ongoing product development, AI development practices to make them a little bit more inclusive, and they will then more directly aligned to some of the ESG metrics, and make sure that you're feeling good about that. And I would just say if you want more resources on this, the Partnership on AI has a lot of great material on their website. Um, so the case study we have here is really one that I think we've spent, and Emily, feel free to jump in too, on this, that um, we could imagine literally thousands with so much of the AI activity, but we decided to focus on healthcare because of some of those risks we were talking about earlier. Um, and it is there we see a lot of startup activity in healthcare, and there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also some real risks, and the risks are potentially a lot rougher than maybe some other other scenarios. So I guess we went after the some of the hard stuff here. And if the company is in their business model analyzing patient activity, um, and they're trying to decrease attrition with AI, right? That there's all kinds of things that we could think of in terms of governance risks, right? There could be that it's just inaccurate. We're recommending patients that, don't fit the hospital needs. And it's leading to wasted costs for the hospital, but it's also potentially really leading to some harm to that patient. They're not getting the right kind of care or the care from the right source that we're but there's a potential on bias, right? That we're giving treatment plans that may have only been sourced from certain demographics. We know that there are disparate health outcomes in the system, but like AI could potentially exacerbate that if it's learning from data that is already biased because it's only focused on certain demographics. You're now multiplying the problem, right? Then obviously on data privacy, we're governed by HIPAA laws here. There's all kinds of potential risks as it relates to data privacy. And really, when we're talking about profiling people, um, we are running into the potential of accessing um, HIPAA regulated data, right? And so the risks are significant. And this is in the healthcare space, and it's a really good example. I mean, I think using some of the governance stuff we heard earlier, and even some of the inclusive development practices on the accuracy side of things, sort of want to make sure that we've trained models, and that we're looking at them in some detail, um, if and when accuracy decreases. Again, this is like an ongoing agile process, if you will, of making sure that the AI product and the AI model is doing what we want it to do. Uh, on bias, we've talked a little bit about how to debias a system. Um, and really it's just like what are the demographic groups, and let's make sure that we're performing in a similar way across those demographic groups. And we've got the data in there, um, in the model that's looking at how a particular medical intervention is performing in different demographic groups. And I think if you're in the healthcare space, you're really well aware of HIPAA. You're well aware of some of the data security needs, and when you add in the layer of, okay, now I'm going to send this data over to an LLM, there's the whole sort of chain around AI and making sure that you've protected that person's privacy, both in the training of the model, but also in operations. If you're asking you're taking someone's data and then asking the LLM to profile them in some ways, um, you are then exposing their data into an AI system, and we want to make sure that the safeguards are there from a privacy perspective. So anyway, lots of opportunity, lots of risk, but there's also, you know, really good ways to mitigate against some of these risks, in some of the more common cases that we see.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. Happy to open up to any questions. We have a few that have come in thus far, so we'll get through this first. Ever find yourself in a conversation with executives who think AI governance will negatively impact ROI? Um, I like to think of kind of AI governance as any other governance practice you would have for a different operational function. So if your employees face safety risks, you wouldn't not have a safety policy or track safety incidents because none have occurred, or you don't think it's that important. Because if there were to be a safety incident or an OSHA violation, that could have pretty significant impacts to the company through insurance claims or kind of fees, regulatory fees associated. So really think of it as kind of maintaining those practices just for a good functioning company. Similarly, you wouldn't not have a code of conduct because, there haven't been any bribery instances, or you don't think that that is a risk. Because if a bribery incident were to occur, that would have pretty significant impacts. So that's kind of how I think about it and frame it. Stephen, feel free to chime in if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the only thing I might add is, we see this all the time in real time and I'll just give you an example. ChatGPT in August updated their model to 5 from 4.0. And when they did it without any governance. There was no way to like maintain 4.0 if you had built like a custom GPT. Um, and so they actually had to like revert back a little bit and say, okay, we're going to give you some choice now to, if you were using like the previous model, like yesterday, we're going to give you access to that today. Um, and so things are moving fast. And the EU law, for example, has been attributing with like putting some of the European businesses behind because they do have to go through some process for each new model. And so I think it's a real like there's got to be a Goldilocks zone in here somewhere though, right? Of wanting to validate and test new models, whether that's stuff that you've created or whether that's something that the vendor's doing. You want to make sure that it's been validated and tested um, before deployment, right? And so we just in the last week have seen upgrades from ChatGPT and Google Gemini and Claude. And so in each of those cases, when the major vendors are doing this, I would really recommend if you're using their APIs to spend a week or two making sure that you're getting the same kind of results. If you've got like a RAG implementation of some sort on your data, before you upgrade that model, like it's really worth just validating it. And I would just say to an executive, like, hey, we've got to still yes, we're in AI. Yes, we want to move quickly. We know the industry is moving quickly. We can't throw we've got to still rely on like the governance and QA processes that we've always sort of held to. Um, because the risk is that this model all of a sudden is not doing what we expected it or wanted it to do. This gets multiplied, I think, a lot too with agents. So, where, the getting the accurate piece of data from this system to this system and then to this system is generally like the use case. And so, an upgrade of a model or upgrade of your own system there really does require some QA work.
We have another question. Are there any recommended tools or strategies to reduce environmental impact of AI use? This is a good question. So I'd say for companies that are leveraging outsourced data centers or cloud hosting, which I'd assume most companies that leverage AI are doing. There are some cloud hosting platforms such as AWS or Azure that have really robust environmental practices. And so it's oftentimes choosing the best option of the hosting platforms versus being perfect because AI does inevitably use a lot of energy. There's a lot of resources needed to manage these data centers. So it's about choosing the best one for those sustainable practices. Um, if a company does manage its own data centers or even when choosing cloud computing or cloud hosting, leveraging renewable energy can also be a way to help mitigate some of that environmental impact. So using solar energy to power the data center can help just create more of a circularity um, given the energy use. But it is a tough question that is definitely being asked, especially with the continuous influx of new data center development to keep up with high AI use. There isn't a perfect answer right now about how AI can kind of be one with the environment, and it's more finding the best solution there.
I think that's all right. If I could just add one,
Mhm.
it's not just I would say in addition to the vendor selection and maybe data center selection, I would also say in real time, like what's your model selection? So uh, if you can use a mini or nano model to get the same output, then use that because it's going to have a lower carbon footprint and it's also potentially going to be a more timely response. If you've got you know the capability to develop your own small language model and not boil the ocean with a large language model, it's probably worth doing that as well. So there are strategies. And the other thing I would say is um, take a look at some of the calculators about um, the sort of basic prompting or engagement with an AI is not quite as bad as we think it might be, or some of the things you've heard. It does get worse to the degree that you're doing like multi-shot, deep research, like deep thinking kind of tasks. Like the energy usage definitely goes up, but it's really like use the right model for the right task.
Definitely. And just one other point there too, some other kind of tangible uh, answers as well would be kind of setting max token limits, for example, on prompts and responses. So you're
Mm.
not, using too many uh, uh, tokens in order to get those answers and has that limit to reduce that energy consumption. Another could be kind of on reducing verbosity in prompt templates. So even those small tweaks can help kind of reduce that energy
It's a
consumption.
really great point about tokens, and should have thought about that. That just to say, like on our platform, we actually give you token counts for prompts so that to like help you with like make that even as you're writing the prompt to like get it to the concise point. And so that's really, really great thinking there, great ideas, and definitely worth leaning into.
Right. Another question we have in private markets, how are firms balancing the operational benefits of AI with its growing energy and water footprint? Are you seeing GPs put any ESG guidelines in place to manage those impacts? Thus far, I have not seen any kind of guidelines be put into place to manage those impacts. I think what's really challenging right now is the huge influx of AI use. And so, kind of figuring out the kind of scale of AI use at portfolio companies is still a practice that a lot of GPs are working towards understanding if they use have any on-prem data centers or are they using cloud hosting. So right now we've seen it's really an information gathering phase versus setting those guidelines. And in order to set those guidelines, you need to know the extent of that usage. So that's kind of what we've seen thus far. I do think that, starting in maybe 2026, especially with the regulations within the US and EU guidelines will become top of mind within that conversation because there will be a better inventory on what companies are using AI for and the extent of that usage. Um, but haven't seen too much of those guidelines put in place thus far outside of kind of the responsible AI and governance protocols like we've discussed. If that is of interest, though, happy to kind of chat about that offline around setting those guidelines. Any other questions? If not, happy to close this out. Really appreciate everyone's time today. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of these conversations about responsible AI practices with the GPs that we're working with, as well as their portfolio companies, and have a lot of tools to help develop those kind of AI governance programs, and also kind of how to kind of assess those ESG implications and how to best manage those. You will be getting a recording of this. So if anyone joined late or had to hop off early, you will be receiving this presentation and also available to have continuous conversations about this after the webinar.